In 1989, the wealthiest 10% of Americans were responsible for 36 cents of every consumer dollar spent in this country. That was already more than their proportional share, but it was a number that reflected a recognizable country, one where middle-income households still drove economic growth. By the second quarter of 2025, that number had climbed to 49.2 cents. Nearly half of all consumer spending in the United States, coming from 1 in 10 Americans, the highest level ever recorded, since the data first started being collected. The headline that week called it a strong consumer spending report. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what that headline is measuring, and more importantly, what it is not. You'll understand why a single government figure can show the economy growing, wages rising, and consumers spending, while your paycheck buys less than it did 4 years ago. Your credit card balance sits higher than you want it to, and nothing about your actual financial life feels like it belongs inside that growth number. Because here's the thing, it doesn't. And that gap between the number and your life is not an accident. It's a feature of how the system is built to be read. Let me take you back to 1989. That's the year economists at Moody's Analytics began breaking apart the national consumer spending number, tracking not just how much Americans spent, but who was doing the spending. At the time, the top 10% controlled about 36% of all consumer expenditures, high but workable. The middle class, the foreman, the teacher, the floor manager, the nurse, was still the engine. They bought houses, they bought cars, they bought appliances on credit and paid them down. The consumer economy had a wide base. Then 3 things happened over the next 3 decades. The first was the stock market explosion of the 1990s. Equity wealth is not distributed evenly in this country. The top 10% own roughly 87% of all corporate stock. When the Dow tripled between 1990 and 2000, the wealth effect kicked in. The economic tendency to spend more when your assets go up in value. That effect was almost entirely concentrated at the top. Middle and lower income households had no meaningful stake in that run. The second was the wage divergence. From the 1970s onward, American worker productivity kept climbing, but wages for the bottom 80% stopped climbing with it. The gains went somewhere. They went up. By the early 2000s, the structural link between what Americans produced and what Americans were paid had quietly broken. The third was 2008. When the housing market collapsed, it wiped out the primary wealth asset of the American middle class, their home equity, and the Federal Reserve's response. Near zero interest rates for nearly a decade inflated asset prices in equities and real estate and investment portfolios. The people who owned assets got richer. The people who didn't. By 2020, the top 10% were driving 43% of all consumer spending. By 2023, 46%. By mid-2025, 49.2%. The highest ever recorded. Here's what the machine looks like from the inside. Every month, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, publishes a figure called Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE. That number, alongside monthly retail sales data, becomes the headline consumer spending figure. It gets cited in White House press briefings. It gets read on cable news. The Federal Reserve uses it to calibrate monetary policy. When it's up, the economy is resilient. When it's down, alarm bells ring. But PCE is an aggregate, one number, a total. It takes the purchasing behavior of 330 million people and collapses it into a single line. It does not tell you who is spending or who has stopped. Think about it this way. Imagine 10 people sharing a restaurant check. 5 of them order water, split a salad, and keep it to $11 each. The other 5 order steak, 2 rounds of wine, and dessert, $99 each. When the check comes, the average is $55 per person. The news reports, Americans spent $55 at dinner tonight. Consumer confidence is strong. 5 people at that table spent $11. That is the PCE report. That is the consumer spending headline. Here's what the actual data shows underneath it. The top 10% of earners, Americans making roughly $250,000 or more account for 49.2% of all consumer spending as of mid-2025. Broaden that to the top 20%, and that group is responsible for 57% of all consumption, up 4 percentage points over the last 3 decades, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. The bottom 80% of the country, every teacher, nurse, warehouse worker, line cook, truck driver, small business owner, is collectively carrying the remaining 43%. And the middle quintile, households sitting right at the median center of the American income distribution, barely moved their spending in real terms between 2023 and 2024, not because they were being careful, because they were already stretched. Prices today are roughly 25% higher than they were before the pandemic. A grocery run that cost $200 in 2019 costs $250 now. That's not discretionary spending, that's just showing up. Here is where the system starts to work against you in a way that almost never gets named directly. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates based on a range of economic signals. Consumer spending is one of the most closely watched. When consumer spending is strong, the Fed has less urgency to cut rates. When rates stay elevated, borrowing becomes expensive. Credit cards charge more, car loans cost more, mortgages cost more, small business credit lines cost more. Now follow this chain all the way through. The wealthy are spending. Their stock portfolios appreciated. Their real estate went up. The wealth effect is working for them in real time. So they travel, they renovate, they dine out, they spend. That spending flows into the aggregate PCE number. The aggregate number looks strong. The Fed reads, resilient consumer, rates hold. The bottom 80% does not have a portfolio. They have a paycheck, a credit card balance, and grocery bills that are 25% higher than 4 years ago. But the number describing their economy, the one the Fed is reading, is being held up by a class of Americans whose financial lives look nothing like theirs. The wealthy are spending. The Fed holds rates. The bottom 80% pays the interest on the debt they're using to absorb what their wages can't cover. This is not a conspiracy. There is no room of people who designed this outcome on a whiteboard. It is something more persistent than a conspiracy. It is a measurement system that was never built to see you clearly, and whose blindness now shapes the policy that lands on your kitchen table. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. New videos every week. The ledger stays open. Let's make this specific. Say you're a logistics supervisor in Memphis. You make $58,000 a year, solidly in the middle of the American income distribution. You've been with your company for 6 years. You got a 3% raise last year. In dollar terms, that's roughly $1,740. But your grocery bill went up, your car insurance went up, your electric bill went up. In real terms, that raise kept you roughly even, maybe slightly behind. You carry $4,200 on a credit card from a furnace repair 2 winters ago. You're paying it down, slowly, because the interest rate on that card is 24.9%. Not because you're a risky borrower, because rates are high, because the Fed looked at the spending number, the one the top 10% are carrying, and did not feel urgency to move. That $4,200 balance, at 24.9% interest, costs you roughly $85 a month in interest alone. Over a year, that is more than $1,000. That is your raise. That is where your 3% went. Or say you're a registered nurse in Cincinnati. You make $74,000. You want to buy a house. The home you can reasonably afford in your neighborhood carries a mortgage payment, at current rates, of around $2,100 a month, up from roughly $1,400 for the same house in 2020. Not because your neighborhood became more desirable, because rates are elevated, because the Fed is reading a spending report that is being sustained by a group of people whose financial life is structurally different from yours. The number says the consumer is strong. You are the consumer. You do not feel strong. Here's what the ledger actually says. Consumer spending in America is not uniformly strong. One narrow segment of consumer spending is strong, And that segment is being used to describe a national condition that does not exist for the majority of Americans. The BEA is not lying. The Moody's analysts are not lying. The Federal Reserve is not lying. But the headline number, the one that travels, the one that gets cited, the one that shapes policy, is built on a foundation that represents a smaller and smaller share of the country every year. In 1989, the top 10% drove 36% of spending. Today, they drive nearly 50%. That shift didn't happen in secret. It happened through wages that stopped climbing, assets that kept appreciating, and a measurement system that was never designed to tell you who's doing the spending, only how much. The economy is being described in averages. You are not living in the average. And until the people reading that number start asking who's inside it, the policy built from it will keep landing on you.